Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as I hope you know now, because we're in our 24th year, I interview writers about their craft, what they're working on now, what they've been doing in the past, what they might be planning for the future. We have on poets, we've had on novelists, journalists, all kinds of writers, and even some other brands of artists. We've had on sculptors, we've had on musicians, actors. It's a pretty wide net. Although we emphasize writing, if you have an idea for an artist of any stripe who might be a good guest for the show, watch for our address at the end of the program. I also want to remind you that cable television, this program and all of our other programs, are made possible by cable contributions and not Dish. So when you see that Dish ad on television, turn it off. Tonight, I'm happy to say we do have a writer. Her name is Susan Gerard, and she has written a book about Charles Dickens and Dante, combining those two unlikely celebrities in one tome. Susan Gerard was born and raised in Hartford and went to school in public schools in Hartford, and then later went to Chaffey, which is also in Connecticut, before she came somewhat north and went to Harvard and took an undergraduate degree there, and also her doctorate in Romance languages, emphasizing French along with Italian and a couple of others. She also spent some years as a union organizer before teaching and before going back to teaching, and then found her home at North Shore Community College, where she taught, I'm honored to say, with me and many other fine teachers for 30 years. Susan Gerard, welcome to the Writer's Block.
Thank you.
I mentioned that was kind of a odd combination of Charles Dickens and Dante.
Very odd.
Tell us about Charles Dickens. Remind us who he is,
okay.
And also about Dante Alighieri.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Charles Dickens, probably people know best from A Christmas Carol. I think it's hard to avoid at least one version of the Christmas Carol, which he wrote, which is actually one of his novellas, his Christmas novellas. He loved Christmas as a holiday, and he wrote short novels for the Christmas holidays. But he's known, truthfully, if I can stick my neck out, I'll say he's the greatest English novelist.
Really?
Yeah, I think so. I think he's the greatest English novelist. And the interesting thing about him, I think that there are a number of things that he and Dante have in common. Dante Alighieri, right, who wrote the great Inferno, which many people have heard of, the Divine Comedy, it's known as, in the 13th century, in 13th century Italy.
Well, the Inferno is one
part of the Divine Comedy, right. We have the Inferno, which is hell. We have Purgatorio, which is for those people who are struggling towards heaven, but
being purged of their crime.
Very far from getting there. And then we have Paradise. So Dante wrote these long poems, which have become classics of world literature. What do he and Dickens have in common? I think when we were conversing, I said one thing they have in common is they both have lasted as reference points throughout centuries, which is kind of interesting. And I mentioned that the last episode of Mad Men, the last season, begins with the hero, the very flawed hero of Mad Men, lying on a beach reading the Inferno, and ends with an explicit comparison to the Tale of Two Cities, where he does something that a character in Tale of Two Cities, Sidney Carton, does, which is to sacrifice himself for another person. And this is Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. And for those of people who have not read Tale of Two Cities, Sidney Carton, who is an alcoholic and has many problems, decides to go to the guillotine for a man that he resembles, and he utters the famous words, "It is a far, far better thing I do than that I have ever done. It is a far, far better place I go to than I have ever gone." But what brought them together in my mind?
Yeah, I want to know
What brought them
is this
together?
on a beach?
No. I in my retirement and even a little bit before, when I began to read and reread all of Dickens' novels, which are very different when you read them as a grown-up than when you are forced to read them in school as a child. And it actually began with almost a mistake. The very last completed novel that Dickens wrote, Our Mutual Friend, which is a great novel, I thought had a chapter in it called Inferno. And that was actually not true. I don't know what got that in my brain, but I began to see, oh my gosh, there's something going on between Dickens and Dante. What there is in this novel are many damned characters, and there's also, as in the Inferno, there's a river, which is the Thames, where people are falling in, and either they are redeemed after this or they drown. And there's a sense of hell. There's a sense of real hellishness in the whole novel. There are more damned villains in this novel than in any of other Dickens novels. So this,
What novel are you talking about now?
Our Mutual Friend, which is Dickens'
It
last.
was unfinished.
It was that The Mystery of Edwin Drood was the unfinished novel. This is his last finished novel, and he wrote it under very difficult circumstances. He was very sick. He was having a secret affair with this young woman, Ellen Ternan, which many people disapproved of. His marriage had broken up. It was a difficult time. He was in a train crash. He was in a train crash where this train that he and Ellen Ternan were riding in was going over a suspension bridge, and the train fell down in the middle of the suspension bridge, which collapsed, and many people were killed. Dickens was not, but he climbed back into the train to help some of the people who were injured and dying. And so he went through a lot of trauma, and some of this is reflected, I think, in this novel. Anyway, I began to see these villains, and
so you were rereading some Dickens.
I was rereading
and you were
Dickens.
rereading A Mutual Friend.
Yes.
And because you're familiar with Dante, no
Right.
doubt from the Romance language
Right.
degree,
Right.
some of these similarities clicked.
I began to see that Dickens had many villains in all of his novels, and it was more of a hypothesis in my mind at the beginning that if you really looked at it, there was a system, a whole moral system throughout Dickens' novels that was very similar to Dante's moral system. It was just a hypothesis.
And so you weren't saying it was causative.
No.
Dante was causative of the system, but there was a lot of similarities.
The similarities, after doing a lot of research, really, I realized came out of their common Christianity. And I'm not a Christian, so it's very surprising that I would write a book really emphasizing the Christianity of these two authors, but they do believe in heaven and hell. They believe in sin and redemption. They believe in characters who are flawed and have the possibility of, through suffering, getting ultimately to heaven, which in Dickens' universe usually means, being happily married. In Dante's, it means literally going to paradise. But
I want to show the book cover. We don't have the book
Not
at
yet.
the moment, unfortunately, but it is available on Amazon, and you can get other information about the book on Amazon or from the book itself after you buy it. This is a photocopy of the cover, and you can see Dickens' Inferno clearly. So was this like an aha moment, a eureka moment? You thought, Dickens and Dante, oh my God. And
Well,
you ran to the desk and started.
didn't run to the desk. I ran into the library and immersed myself in the stacks of Tufts Library, which is near me. I had not done intensive research in a library for a very long time. I found myself in front of huge shelves of Dickens books, which probably none of the Tufts students are reading anymore, and huge shelves
certainly
of
not in
Dante.
print.
And I did a lot of research in biographies of Dickens and Dickens criticism in Dante, and I took a class at Tufts, which, because we're Medford residents, we have the ability to take Tufts classes at very, very low prices. So I took a class on Dante's Inferno by a wonderful Dante scholar. So I learned more about Dante as well. So I was really steeping myself in the ideas and then trying out to see if the 9 circles of Dante's Inferno, he has 9 circles, starting with the least sinful and going down to the worst, which are in the 9th circle, the traitors.
But they're all condemned.
They're all condemned.
They're
They're
in
all
hell.
doomed.
And I want to read from the book description couple brief lines about the overall purpose. My book takes Dickens' villains and drops them into their appropriate circles of Dante's Inferno. From the outer circle of the indifferents, that's the least sinful, where we find characters like Podsnap, Mrs. Corney, and Mrs. Gamp, to the deepest circle of the traitors, where we can encounter the demonic Daniel Quilp and that heap of infamy, Uriah Heep.
Who is on the cover.
Is that?
That's Uriah Heep and
he?
David Copperfield on the cover, right.
Tell us again who is this?
Uriah Heep.
This is Uriah Heep.
Right. He is one of the worst of Dickens' characters, and he's
sort of suave.
Doesn't he look that way? He always claims to be very humble. He always says, "I'm very humble, Master Davy." He pretends to be very nice and sweet, but he actually is scheming all the time to destroy everyone in the novel. And
so he's very sort of like a Dorian Gray character.
Yes,
he's kind of outwardly suave, but extremely evil.
He's actually kind of creepy outwardly too. He has these very clammy hands. So David, when he first meets him, and he tries to shake hands, he has these clammy hands. He just wants to wipe his hands off. He immediately feels there's something wrong with this person. But
I can tell from your attitude and your enthusiasm, you enjoyed putting these people.
I totally
enjoyed
them. I totally enjoyed them.
In our conversations and emails before the show, you mentioned that you have a couple levels and a couple types of sinners who are your faves. Can you tell us about those?
Oh, gosh. Now that you're saying this. Well, favorites only in the sense that they're wonderful characters. I mean, they're wonderful characters. Mrs. Gamp, who you mentioned, is one of Dickens' greatest characters, and she's in Martin Chuzzlewit. She's this alcoholic nurse who also is charged with laying out the dead, and she's equally indifferent to the dead that she lays out and to the people she's supposed to take care of. She's only interested in getting her next drink. But she speaks in this amazing English that only Dickens could make up. It's just, she has this particular way of speaking, which is just marvelous. I mean, there are many, many characters. I do love Dickens, and of course I love his sense of social justice. And I did bring a little piece about a character named Myrtle, who is
from the book.
From
your
book.
Oh, please.
Myrtle is okay. He is in the section of the Inferno, which is the 8th circle, pretty far down, of fraud. And fraud, according to Dante, was divided into 10 what he called bulges or pouches. I should explain one other thing before I get into this, which is that Dante has a concept called the contrapasso, which means that people's punishment fits their crime. For example, in Dante, the lustful characters are blown away in these intense windstorms. And in David Copperfield's Steerforth, who I put in the category of the lustful, dies in a huge apocalyptic storm on the ocean. So it's very similar. People have the punishments that fit their crimes. Okay, I'll just read a little bit about Myrtle, who is Dickens' day Bernard Madoff. I don't know if people read the papers, they know about Bernard Madoff. He was a
big
big Ponzi
yeah.
schemer who defrauded hundreds of people of their life savings, millions of dollars. And Myrtle is Dickens' Madoff. Okay. Theft takes many forms in Dickens' novels. His primary concern, however, is not with small-time criminals like the charming Artful Dodger and Oliver Twist, or those many among the London destitute who were forced to steal for mere survival. The Dodger is a cunning pickpocket, but he is also a child who has been abandoned and taken in by the manipulative grown-up Fagin. According to Dickens, petty theft was often treated far too harshly by the judicial system of his time. Dickens' true-life account of a desperately poor mother named Mary Jones, who was caught stealing a piece of cloth and hung for her crime, is heartrending, and this is in a preface to another novel. The woman's husband was pressed, their goods seized for some debts of his, and she, with 2 small children, turned into the streets a-begging. It is a circumstance not to be forgotten that she was very young, under 19, and most remarkably handsome. She went to a linen draper's shop, took some coarse linen off the counter, and slipped it under her cloak. The shopman saw her, and she laid it down. For this, she was hanged. This is the preface to Barnaby Rudge. Dickens makes it quite clear that any crime referred to here was certainly not that of theft. Like Dante, Dickens is mainly concerned with grand theft, the criminal who robs from all society. In this, there is no better example than the financier Myrtle, the prototype for today's Bernard Madoff, although unfortunately such swindlers need no prototype. In fact, the character of Myrtle was based on a real person of Dickens' era, the fraudulent banker John Sadleir. When his dishonest financial schemes were exposed, he slit his own throat. Myrtle is clearly in the world of fraud as he manages to deceive everyone with his financial schemes.
Forgive me, Myrtle is for which novel again?
This is from Little Dorrit. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
He's in Little Dorrit. Society with a capital S worships Myrtle, the most powerful financier of his time, just as the ancient Israelites worshiped the golden calf. Most of the characters in Little Dorrit, from the Tight Barnacles to Arthur Clemens and Little Dorrit's newly enriched father, entrust their fortunes to Myrtle, convinced that he is to be trusted absolutely. From the first, Dickens' ironic description of Myrtle alerts the reader that he is, on the contrary, not to be trusted at all. Mr. Myrtle was immensely rich, a man of prodigious enterprise, a Midas without the ears who turned all he touched into gold. He was in everything good, from banking to building. He was in Parliament, of course. He was in the city, necessarily. He was chairman of this, trustee of that, president of the other. The weightiest of men had said to projectors, "Now what name have you got? Have you got Myrtle?" And the reply, being in the negative, had said, "Then I won't look at you." When Dickens resorts to capital letters like this, which is in the passage, his message to the reader is clear: look out. Yet this Myrtle, who is worshipped by everyone, is as isolated and lonely as a Scrooge or a Ralph Nickleby. He has a wife who is only interested in the trappings that wealth brings her, the grand parties, the jewels, and the adulation of society. She has no interest in her husband, and the feeling is evidently mutual. She is for him just another possession. Quote, "It was not a bosom to repose upon, but it was a capital bosom to hang jewels upon." Mr. Myrtle wanted something to hang jewels upon, and he bought it for that purpose. Myrtle is a shadowy, secretive figure who hates appearing even at his own parties. He prefers to spend time alone in a room with his wife's pet parrot. Everyone idolizes him, but nobody truly knows him. This may be just as well, since he, like Madoff, is evidently one grand Ponzi scheme. He takes people's money promising lucrative return on investment, but it mysteriously disappears. Those who invest in him will lose everything.
Let me just interrupt. I had a couple questions that occurred to me.
I can stop there.
When you describe Myrtle
Yes.
from Little Dorrit,
Right.
And kind of analyze his questionable character. Not
Yeah.
questionable, is awful character.
Yeah.
Are you pointing out what in him will make him fit perfectly into Dante, and then you go and say he would
Yes.
fit in this pouch at this level
Right.
of Dante's hell because of these reasons?
Right, right. So what
To-
I'm looking at is the kind of moral issues that are raised by both these authors, and they both have these moral systems where the bad guys, if you want to put it this way, get punished. In Dickens' world, they're punished in the real world, okay? Actually, Myrtle winds up committing suicide, which, according to some commentators, Madoff attempted to do but then did not. His son actually did commit suicide, which is rather sad. But in Dante's world, they are punished in the Inferno itself. So they're punished in hell. We see them getting punished in a variety of ways.
The big social question is,
Yes.
does Dante's social consciousness, or did his social consciousness, or did Dickens' social consciousness do anything, accomplish anything?
Did Dickens' social consciousness accomplished a lot. I mean, first of all, he had a big influence on the issue of child labor and changed the child labor laws in England. He raised people's understanding about a whole number of issues. He actually did a lot. He was extremely sympathetic with prostitutes and the plight of prostitutes. Not with the pimps; they're in hell. The prostitutes, by the way, are not in hell. But he set up with a woman who was a benefactor. He set up a rehabilitation home for prostitutes where they learned a trade, and many of them, went abroad and started new lives, and he worked with them. He actually influenced his society.
So
in a
I know
variety
he
of
he
ways.
was politically active himself,
Yes.
and then socially active in good works.
Right.
So he didn't rely always on just presenting a kind of moral fable for the public.
No.
I got a 5-minute signal from Nick about a minute ago.
Oh, my-
A couple questions I wanted to get to.
Yeah.
How long did it take you from the aha moment, this is like Dante, I could combine these two gentlemen,
Yeah.
to the completion of the book?
About 3 years.
3 years.
Yes.
And that included the research
Yeah.
and the course in Dante,
Right.
and the writing,
Right.
and the finding of a publisher,
Right.
and finally getting the book out. 3
Right.
years. And that's pretty regular work every day, every week.
Yes,
It's
I
not
love
like
to-
maybe when I'm at the beach on Tuesday, I'll think about it for a few minutes. It's
Well, I wouldn't
fairly
say-
steady work.
I didn't work on it every single day, but I did put a lot of work on it over those 3 years. Sometimes more intensely than others, but it's been continuous. And then there's the revision process, which you understand. I've probably rewritten the book about 15 times. As
Yes.
we taught our students,
It's finished.
you have to revise.
Yeah. Do you write longhand or do you write on the computer?
I write on the computer. My handwriting is indecipherable at this point.
And it's available now.
It's
Here
available.
we are in November.
Yes,
It's available on Amazon.
on Amazon.
So it would make a pretty good, appropriate Christmas present.
it,
Given Dickens,
it-
Dickens
Christmas
and
Carol?
his love for Christmas.
yes, he loved Christmas.
I just got the 3-minute signal.
Okay.
So I want to begin to wrap up, and I want to show this once more. This is Dickens' Inferno with a picture of Uriah Heep, Heep, on the cover. And this is the book that Susan Gerard has been describing about where Dickens' evil people, and a couple good ones, would fit in Dante's Inferno, or Purgatory, or Paradise, but mostly the fun place, the Inferno.
That's right.
Susan, thank you very much for coming down on the Writer's Block.
Thank you for having me.
I want to thank our TV audience, too, for being with us. If you've learned something about Dante and about the Inferno, as well as Dickens' evil people and where they belong in the Inferno, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.